here. We're going to start in just a second. I'd like to thank the David Nolan New York Gallery for sponsoring May's programming option, and all of you for being here. It's going to be a great night. Bonnie Jones will do a solo set of music, and then there'll be a short break, and then she'll talk to me a bit about her work and ideas. So thanks for being here. Bonnie Jones.
Hello, welcome to ESS. Thank you for coming to visit with me tonight. And thank you to ESS and to Ken and to everyone who's helped out today to set up this very nice room. I think I'm gonna play 2 sets, one in the 20-ish minute range, and then I'll stop, and then maybe I'll do another one in the 10-ish minute range, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes. And then we'll have that break, and then chat with Ken.
S in still, like S in sift, like N in near, like M in mutter, like H in hem, like ing in bring, the A in mark, the all in saw, the oo in loop, the U in put, the E in meet, like E in lend, like we in weather. The P in spare, the P in pattern, like T in still, like T in turns, the T in towards, the K in skin, the C in call, the G in gesture, the ch in chin, like S in still, like S in sift, like N in near, like M in mutter, like H in hem, like ing in bring, the A in mark, the all in saw, the oo in loop, the U in put, the E in meet, like E in lend, like we in weather. The P in spare, the P in pattern, like T in still, like T in turns, the T in towards, the K in skin, the C in call, the G in gesture, the ch in chin, like S in still, like S in sift, like N in near, like M in mutter, like H in hem, like ing in bring, the A in mark, the all in saw, the oo in loop, the U in put, the E in meet, like E in lend, like we in weather. The P in spare, the P in pattern, like T in still, like T in turns, the T in towards, the K in skin, the C in call, the G in gesture, the ch in chin, like S in still, like S in sift, like N in near, like M in mutter, like H in hem, like ing in bring, the A in mark, the all in saw, the oo in loop, the U in put, the E in meet, like E in lend, like we in weather. The P in spare, the P in pattern, like T in still, like T in turns, the T in towards, the K in skin, the C in call, the G in gesture, the ch in chin, like S in still, like S in sift, like N in near, like M in mutter, like H in hem, like ing in bring, the A in mark, the all in saw, the oo in loop, the U in put, the E in meet, like E in lend, like we in weather. The P in spare, the P in pattern, like T in still, like T in turns, the T in towards, the K in skin, the C in call, the G in gesture, the ch in chin, like S in still, like S in sift, like N in near, like M in mutter, like H in hem, like ing in bring, the A in mark, the all in saw, the oo in loop, the U in put, the E in meet, like E in lend, like we in weather. The P in spare, the P in pattern,
do a little quick change. This one I'm gonna stand for. Is that gonna mess up your view? So that first one was easy. The second one is a little bit harder. Whoops, what did I miss something here? Missing something. Missing a cable. Oh, there it is. Thanks. So I think it's a 15-minute break to get a beverage on the bar, patio bar, and then come back to chat.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks. Whew, so did I.
I loved it.
I'm a little breathless.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Already feels better now.
No, you can drive it earlier.
Yeah. Oh shit, yeah. That's pretty bad. Yeah, I have a friend that lives in Phoenix and she says it's just like, it's like their summer is like our winter. That's how she puts it, you know? Like you just don't go out,
But you
you
can-
just stay inside all the time, like you can't, things slow down.
You really feel it.
Yeah,
Talking about that.
just as, I might as well stay.
Right, no,
We're in the sun,
I
like, you
agree.
can't escape.
I mean, I'm from Minnesota, you know. I can deal with the cold more than I can deal with the heat. But yeah, there's nothing you can do with the heat when you go outside, yeah. I just think it'd be weird to live in the desert areas and just unwalk or do some other completely different thing all the time. That would be
Oh, yeah. Yes, I'll be here. Yeah. Right, you're both. Cool, yeah, I'll be there for sure. Is there anything?
I don't think there is. I gotta follow up with him. They're both staying. Something like that. Yeah, I can figure that out. I'm gonna follow up on all that stuff.
Do you like the right or the left?
My stuff's here, so if it's okay.
Okay, that's good.
I have to reference the computer because there was like a bunch of quotes from you that I wanted to get right.
Oh, okay, cool.
Normally I just scrawl things on a piece of paper.
That's cool. I can do that.
Get everyone get situated.
Let me do this thing where I'm responsible for my electronics when I put liquids near them.
Ah,
I have this thing where I'm sure everybody who plays electronics, table electronics, has this thing where it seems like everybody gravitates towards putting the liquid like right on the table.
yeah.
So I try to be responsible.
Super. We get our super. Yeah, super. Really great.
Thanks.
Okay. There's still some open seats if you guys want to sit down, or feel free to hang out there.
We won't talk too long, I promise.
Yeah. everybody? We good at it? Yeah, okay. One more time for Bonnie Jones. I also want to thank Bonnie for being willing to sit down with me and talk a bit about her music and work. I got to hear her in Baltimore about a year ago. It was a double bill. No, not in Baltimore, in DC, yeah. And then...
different cities.
Yeah, different cities. They're all the same when you're from the
No, they're not.
They're not, you're right. But then actually, first time to get to talk to you at all in depth was after a Ben Hall show last summer, which was one of those evenings that I wish that I had a chance to record everything that was talked about, because it was a really amazing set of discussions that happened after Ben's performance. So I want to thank that introduction, Ben. And one of the things that came up in that course of conversation was something that I found really interesting, because often there's a discussion amongst musicians that I know and questions raised. Why is it that with, let's say, more experimental music, people struggle in the audience, or apparently seem to struggle more with sound-based experimentation than visually based experimentation? Like, people can go to a museum or a gallery and look at artwork that's, let's say, more abstracted or even confrontational, and will, if they don't understand it, will say, oh, I don't understand it, but they won't get confrontational about it. Whereas music can trigger a more severe response. And you commented on the physicality of music in a way that I hadn't really heard before. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, if you can go back to that, or if you've talked about that in other situations, just your thoughts about the physicality of sound and how it might be affecting people and their response.
I think it loops into this first piece that I played, which is seemingly very amorphous and vast in the sonic landscape, but actually is quite specifically tuned, as it were, to particular frequencies that I was interested in, which is 165 and 228, which approximates the rough low end and high end of my speaking voice. Somewhere in 165 to 228 at my sort of higher speaking voice, and my lower speaking voice is where I'm situated. So when I started to get into listening to sine tones a lot, that's when I sort of started to think a lot more as this sound as material concept. Partially because when you play sine tones that are very close to your natural frequencies, you get all of this insane psychoacoustic when you're talking through them. So maybe, for instance, if you have, I have an app, it's called Frequency Generator, very aptly named. Free for Android, $2 for iPhones. So just saying. But if you get this tone generator and you want to test what your speaking frequency is, you hit the button, and I think human female voices tend to be somewhere around like 160 to 250, and then male voices are like 10 or 20 hertz lower. You can look that up on the internet, because there's kind of an established range for female and male vocals. And you can spin the little dial, it gives you all the frequencies. You can go all the way up to supersonic and then go down to subsonic. But if you keep talking while you're listening to the tone, there's going to become a point when your speaking voice starts to seem almost like it's doing all of this like special effect. It'll start to wobble. You'll be feeling like there's something strange happening in your ears, and there's going to be this kind of effect that happens. Like, the effect mostly is like if I was to sing or speak into some of these pure sine tones, I could modulate them. I could make the sound change, because my vibration of my speaking voice is sort of interacting with the vibration of the sound. And so when I started to investigate like sine tone stuff for my musical work, then that kind of opened up this whole sort of pseudoscience world of sine tone pharmacologies and these things called the solfeggio frequencies, which are supposed to be frequencies that are in tune with cell regeneration and, you know, mindfulness and all of these other parts of physical interactions with vibrations. which is really cool stuff and very interesting to research. But at its fundamental level, it reminds you that sound is a vibration, kind of squeezing its way through the material of air and literally entering your body, because you are a thing that it encounters and it goes inside you. And when I realized that in its basic physical element, then it kind of like, it was immediate to me, like, why people feel music, not just psychologically feel music, but physically feel music, why the musician's responsibility is sort of interesting, why people throw bottles at people's heads who play electronic improvised music. Not me, but friends of mine. But yeah, there's it's visceral, like it's physical. It's not, it doesn't stop in one dimension. There's an intimacy that is unavoidable with the feeling of vibrations entering your body. It's probably why music makes you have such strong psychological reactions. Mm-hmm. But on an interesting level, it raises the stakes on your compositional ideas. Mm-hmm. Like you get to sort of think about what it means to, like, for me to play music and like literally like touch all of you. And that's how I think of it when I play. I'm like touching all of you. And there's some interesting responsibility with that.
Mm-hmm. You brought up the point just now about composition, and right before you played, you mentioned how writing has been kind of a compositional reference. Could you talk about that a little bit? How you mean that in terms of organization?
Sure. So I studied poetry and writing all through college, all through when I was a young kid. That was my first creative expression. And then when I was in college, maybe, I started to get interested in language poetry. I don't know if some of you study writing and know of the so-called language poets, Lynn Higinian, Bruce Andrews, a sort of a set of poets who were interested in the materiality of language, is how they would often frame it. And so I got interested in that writing, and then I was doing work that I think probably fell within the line of that tradition, where I was just kind of contemplating words as objects. And because of that, I was contemplating how meaning happens in language. In like the smallest unit, the phoneme or the syllable or the smallest piece of language, to the visual language, whatever the printed word is, to the spoken language. And because compositionally I was always into like, material. Like if every word I put in a poem was like a sculpture, material. Then I played fast and loose with meaning. Meaning was a little bit more of a sort of secondary, though important, but secondary kind of resonance. It would be like, okay, here's a good analogy. It would be like if you made a sculpture, but the sculpture had a smell. So the sculpture would be the poem, and the smell would be the meaning of the language. So letting it be kind of like an environmental residual thing from the language. And then as soon as I got interested in the sounds that I'm making now, it was actually a fairly short step to think about then language or sound rather, as certain kinds of like materials. But because I was a poet and I did like the smell of poetry, I was really interested in the meaning of sound as another residual. Like, what could that be? How do I play with that?
So you're talking about in terms of the sounds themselves, being objects that you sequence and manipulate and overlap. Mm-hmm. And it's more on that level of the connection with language as being a compositional tool.
I think so. Okay. And a certain investigation of, I don't know if to call it like a syntax, but mm-hmm. I think the music probably does feel like there's a certain kind of syntactical logic. Mm-hmm. I mean, for me it does, and also it does feel like sometimes even it feels a little like an essay, or maybe even feels a little bit like a lecture. But there is a little bit of a certain kind of, some of the forms of language that I think end up popping up mm-hmm. in the music. But I think in its foundation, it's this idea of there being a certain interplay between language and form that I like to really get blurry.
Mm-hmm. I had some questions about David Tudor, because you brought his name up in some of the things you sent me to read.
Mm-hmm.
And the quotes were good, so if it's okay if I can just quote.
Sure.
Yeah. This is Bonnie's words. I resonate with composer David Tudor's approach to electronic instruments when he notes, quoting him, "I try to find out what's there, not to make it do what I want, but to release what's there. The object should teach you what it wants to hear." And then you say, this act of offering agency to material and object and this ability for an instrument to become a collaborator was very motivating for my artistic practice. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So does everybody, do some of you not know David Tudor? I'll give you the quick one sentence David Tudor. He was an early electronic music innovator, early sort of like post-war electronic devices, probably oscillators, early computers. And at that time, the world of electronic music was relatively open, which is to say there wasn't any sort of like script for like, you know, how to make electronic music, because the instruments were being kind of, they were revealing their possibilities in the act of playing them and figuring out what kind of sounds they would do. So there was that interesting kind of like tension between agency and then like, let's call it agency and like revelation or something. Whereas you as the artist go into an instrument with the attempt to make it do whatever you think it should do, rock and roll, classical, whatever. And then during that time period, I think of it as this idea of experimentation, which is that, well, maybe this instrument shows me what its natural kind of inclination is as an instrument, particularly since some of those things were not instruments, but were instead various testing equipment for various war devices. So there's something interesting to be said, like, let's repurpose the oscillator and figure out what it could do for, what it could say to me musically. And there's something about I think the thing that interested me was, again, this kind of like, you know, idea of like, you don't necessarily want, you know, like agency is an important word for women of color, right? It's actually it's like there's a constant sense of trying to understand the situations which give and which take away agency. And there is something interesting about moving into an instrumental practice that is both a negotiation of the states of having agency and then releasing agency, and having that be a kind of interesting feedback loop with your instrument. So it's like I can go into this instrument and like 75% of the time I kind of know what it's going to do, and then like what I did in that last piece, actually it was this one. What I did in that last piece was like the 25% of the time I have no clue what this instrument is going to do. Like it's a circuit, it's a little electro microchip brain that's trying to run a certain circuit, a certain path, and yet I can't control that. I mean, I'm distorting it and I'm kind of interfacing with it, and it's going to do something that I don't know about. And usually the results are quite delightful, I'm happy to report, and it doesn't, instruments rarely want to hurt me, so that's good. So I'm okay with that kind of like negotiation of the agency. But yeah, I like thinking about, you know, there is some interesting thought that's happening about the sort of agency of objects, which is interesting to think about from like what do they call that? It's object-oriented ontology.
Okay.
Basically, it's like the life of objects, which if you talk to anybody who has been diagnosed as an ADHD, they know all about the life of objects. They think about objects in a much more complete way than folks who do not have that. I just learned that because a friend of mine was like, I just thought everybody thought about objects this way. Like the way that she related to like objects in her life was very different than people who did not have ADHD. It wasn't an anthropomorphization. It's not like she made them human. It was that she recognized them as having a certain kind of agency and autonomy that she was interacting with that was very singular and very like, you know, on the same level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You keep leading the questions really well, because I wanted to ask you about.
I read all your notes earlier, Ken. I got all your notes.
Oh, that makes it so much easier. The thing you just brought up about, 75% of the time you know what the things are going to do, and 25% they have their own way of resulting or their own agency. I was curious, like, in terms of, I don't know if the right term is practice, but how do you work on developing the sonic tools that you implement in performances? I mean, you build objects, there's obviously goals that you've got for things, but how do you work on that? And then control isn't a great word, but you're selecting what you want to work with. How do you develop the tools? Whereas, like, with conventional instruments, like, for example, I play the clarinet, there's like traditions of how you develop skills on them. This is like still a quite open field. So how do you go about that work?
Well, I don't know. I think the thing about working with this kind of like, quote unquote junk electronics is that there's not a lot of formulations that you have to follow. So in the same way that, like, I talked about going into the instrument and letting the instrument kind of reveal its sort of sonic interests, like, if I take this as the instrument and then I make it like this entire table, then this entire table is the instrument, and then everything on the table starts to can speak to me in the act of improvisation, which I find to be the most efficient and effective and revealing way to learn what objects would like to say, because you're just moving through it, you're interacting, things happen, things move together, they layer, you're hearing things, and you're responding. So in terms of the pedals and stuff, that's kind of how I develop that language. But I also have something that I have a little bit more control over, except for I don't have control over the time. So all of the samples that I use are samples that I've been building into a like sample database. I guess now it's been like something like 10 years or something. And I don't add new things to the sample database that often. As it turns out, I use the same samples over and over and over again, and have been using them for almost a decade. And every single sample is like a little child that I'm very familiar with now. They're all very familiar to me. Every single tiny nuance of some feedback or some strange artifact that happened when I was recording a bathroom or whatever, they're all very familiar to me, so that when I use them, I can use them as if they're just, like a note I can play on the clarinet that's actually, like it's a perfected kind of, it's almost like it's not perfected, but it's a very exact sound that I can put in a very exact place. So there's that kind of instrumentation that I find really interesting to explore, like what does it mean to say that an instrument is any sound that your body and the things on your table could produce. But then there's also this other kind of thing about the samples, which is time passes. Here's a good example. Example sample. Okay, so this is a tape cassette player. You all are familiar with these if you were born before 95? I don't know what the cutoff is for tape cassette. But this is even more antiquated. This is a 6-minute looping cassette tape that was used in answering machines. And the tape cassette here is now a very rich sample database for me to use. But it's I call it like a palimpsesting database, right? So it's 6 minutes. I play this in live performances all the time. All that feedback is me just like pressing all the keys at the same time and using the internal microphone to create feedback. But all of the recording is recording the concert over and over. Whatever concert is on here, it's over and over and over again. This cassette and this other cassette are a good 6 years in. So maybe I've recorded over this cassette like 50 times. I played it in concerts for the last decade. And sometimes other people are playing with me, so it's cool. Like, if you listen to this 6 minutes straight up, you'll get all of these little fragmented pieces of 50. I mean, by that time, it's probably only the last 10, but different, like, concerts that are erased and played over and over. And so that, to me, that's like the thing about the samples and using them for a really long time, is that there is like a psychological component to a sound that you recorded yourself and you play in your set and you have a relationship to that is a little bit more indelible than the characteristics of that sound. And when I play those samples, you know, I feel things. I feel their history. I feel them as if I know them. And to me, that changes the nature of the performance.
Okay, like the sense of memory with the sound.
Yeah, it just brings these elements in that remind me of things that that in an improvisation, when it's not about the technical characteristics of the instruments that are improvising, but it's about the psychological headspace. Like as a solo performer, when I don't have anybody to bounce off of, I can reproduce an interesting psychological sort of negotiation by using these samples, because they have so many embedded memories and associations just held inside them.
I find that incredibly fascinating, because the hardest thing for me to work on musically is solo improvised music. And one of the factors you've got is this 25% of non-control,
that
which
helps.
you've got to contend with. And then this issue of bringing in the samples, which are a frame of reference that you play off of in the particular performance. Those are really ingenious agents in the process of being spontaneous, because there's the paradox of how do you surprise yourself if you're generating everything.
Yeah, it's true. I never thought about it that way, but it keeps alive. It does keep the liveness. Like it makes it just enough unpredictability and just enough. Like, here I am going down the path of this music, but I play this sample, and because I don't chart it down completely, when the sample comes on, I go into that place. That last sample, first piece, I'm on the roof in Mexico. If you've been in Mexico, you've heard that. It's like the tortilla. It's not a tortilla. It's like that puffed air, I forget what they're called. It's like a puffed air little sort of rice cake, and it comes out of this crazy machine that goes, and it squeals when it forces the air onto the rice that puffs it out the other side. It's like a flat popcorn machine kind of. But I'm on the roof, and there's a cricket, a really loud cricket, because for some reason the crickets in Mexico are really loud.
You're probably about this big.
So it's like going on the roof, and then in the distance, because I'm on a roof that's like 10 stories high, in the distance you hear all of those, it's late at night, you hear all of those like puffed rice machines squealing, and it's loud. And I'm in downtown in the centro, Mexico City, and it's so specific, and that sound, because I've played it and used it so many times, it's so specific, and I'm right there, and yes, I planned to play that last, but where I came from, I had no idea where I would necessarily be coming from sonically, and the way that it falls into that space, it just changes. I think it changes it might not change anything for the audience per se, but it changes my body, and then my body is the performer interfacing in this environment.
Yeah, thank you. That's really informative. I just have a couple more quick questions, I think, and then. All
right, I'll be concise.
No. The question.
I told you I studied language. I got a lot of words.
The answer part is wonderful. I wanted to get a little bit into things you brought about the political ramifications of your work, and there's a quote from you. I propose that the act of short-circuiting symbolically, but also literally, through the circuit bending of electronic instruments, and historical trajectory and status quo narrative, musical structure, or expectation is an intentional, valid, and liberatory compositional method for women and people of color. And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about that in depth.
So the two worst things I received in grad school. Let's play a game called The Two Worst Things I Ever Heard in Grad School. The first was a sort of like demand that I identify my trajectory, my historical trajectory. Like, where's your work? What is the historical trajectory of your work? And I remember saying, like, that's really hard to do when if I am to look at the history that's been documented of this work, all I see are white guys. Like, what am I going to do with that? Like, why are you asking me to identify with a historical trajectory that looks nothing like me? Like, how would I make the music of these white men who have gone before me? Or why should I be expected to be in dialogue with that or make music from that or in that trajectory? So that was bad thing number one. And the second bad thing was someone who said, why are you trying to invent the wheel all the time, Bonnie? Why are you always trying to like reinvent the wheel? Like, why are you trying to like make the forms that you're producing more complicated than they need to be? And the thing that kind of bummed me out about that was this assumption that like we all think we are, like we think that people are like following what is the wheel, like we assume that people should be following whatever the wheel is, and that somehow like some kind of idiosyncratic figuring it out on your own is not appropriate in thinking about what your music practice could be for you. So it's probably no surprise to people in electronic music scenes, like for the first decade, like most of the time I was the only woman, and certainly the only woman of color in all of the concerts and situations that I was in. Festivals, shows, usually the audience. So I mean, really it was like a very distinct feeling of like, okay, well, I really want to make this music because I actually do think, as that statement said, I mean, I felt a liberation playing electronic music. I felt that this relationship to these materials that are kind of beyond history in a way, like, nobody's a master of circuit bending in a certain sense because it's such a atypical thing, and these sounds that, it's like, oh, I can really play a sine tone, like I shred on the sine tone. Nobody does that. That doesn't exist. Like these are not gendered sounds. They're slippery with history. They're almost more like science experiments than they are like music. That's liberation, because that's not a coded set of tools that I have to work with and try to shrug off the burden of the history of electronic music or any other music. I'm sure people who are conservatory trained feel that burden. I mean, there's a lot of history that presses down. So part of the thing that I found about this music was that it offered me a little bit of like a way to like have an actual sonic material that didn't actually have to be burdened by its history. And it would be hard to put gender. I mean, noise music, yes, it's another conversation, because it got kind of put in a place like this kind of harsh noise, kind of like masculine sort of identification. But I found it to be very liberatory. I found it to be a really good way to express a very specific, whatever your specific identity was, in a relatively loose framework of sound production.
And to follow that, I'd like to, if you could talk a little bit about, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Techna?
Techne?
Okay.
Techne, Techna, and Techne.
Yeah.
All work.
Oh, thank you.
Unless anyone in the room is Greek, in which case you should school me on the proper pronunciation, which I think is Techna.
Okay.
But Techne is usually what I say.
Okay, and that's with Suzanne Thorpe, this group that you put, or this practice that you put together. We could talk about that a little bit because it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, so I do. I'm one of those people that say things like improvised music saved my life, which I do think is actually probably true. I think it probably did, like, give me, like in that most frustrated, confused moment when I needed a creative expression that I, pardon the language, I didn't feel colonized by. Like, there was something about electronic music that really helped me, and especially improvisatory technique. And so then, that was like whatever, my 20s or 30s, and then sometime towards the end, sometimes in the middle of my 30s, I was kind of like trying to figure out, like, I was getting tired of the scene. I was getting tired of the, being just around guys all the time, and I was like, what am I going to do about this situation? I was like, I don't know if I can argue with curators anymore. I don't think I can argue with organizers of festivals. I'm just tired of being that person. who like has a gin and tonic and then yells at the organizer for the lack of women on the bill. I just didn't want to do that anymore. So I was like, I got to get them young. I got to go straight to the youth. And so then I was hanging out with Suzanne at a show, and I was like, Suzanne, I think I just need to teach young girls how to make electronic music. Maybe that's the thing to do. And she's like, that's what I want to do. And literally, like, then we just started working together. So our general idea is like young women of color, especially, but women or female-identified folks really could, and I think of it more as not necessarily that I want them all to play electronic music, but that if I apply a certain idea that helped me when I was playing this music, which is experimentation and like a non-gendered material and just like a certain kind of play and a certain kind of like, I can let my instrument be the same thing as me, which is a very interesting interplay. I felt like that would be a good lesson to learn for these kids, and that if they could embody that and feel like my instrument is me, like I can make it, I can do something with like how I imprint on it and it imprints on me. I thought that would be a cool thing to teach young kids. So we started a group that teaches electronics and like DIY instrument building to those young folks. And I'm very happy that Kate Walsh, who is one of our big supporters in Chicago, doing workshops this year. Support Kate Walsh!
Super. If you feel up to it, because I know you traveled a long time, would you be willing to answer
all the way from DC.
All the way from Baltimore.
Exactly. Baltimore, Washington. The Washington comes second.
Definite. Would you be up to answering some questions?
Sure.
from the audience?
I know I talked you guys ears off, so don't feel bad if you have nothing that you want to ask.
Any questions for Bonnie?
Ben!
I have a question just because of the way that the way that you kind of format your formal decisions that are literally circuits, but also you're creating circuits, which then you kind of feed through these other pedals that are both political and gendered. I'm wondering how you, when you're making these formal decisions, how you think about tempo. Because it seems to me like all the recordings that I've heard when I've seen you play live, YouTube, there's like a very interesting and specific tempo interplay that I don't necessarily hear with like a lot of the people that I would associate with the kind of scene that you came up through, where it seems like, and now we're going to take a silence. And the silence is a bit arbitrary.
Yeah.
You seem to work through kind of what I hear as much more musical forms, and I don't mean that as a slight in any way.
Yeah.
So I was just curious about how you think.
I think that's intuition. I don't ever think about it because I choose, like, if I lay out any roadmap for stuff, it's all based in like what did I say here? It's stuff. It's really like poetic. It's like the voice modulates. That's the first part. Then it's and then we go into the loop of history, where you know this is. Good, I don't know. And then I'm in the like, and then I go into like in which language is like a phoneme, and then the language modulates, and then I go towards the roof. So I think like tempo wise, I think it could be my poetry training. Maybe that's how it creeps in.
Like a syntactical.
A certain syntactical rhythm, the idea of the sentence, a kind of way of like moving through. I mean, the thing that I think the one thing that I know that I'm interested in is that even when I was writing poetry, like I was always really interested in like giving the audience or the reader something that felt different than like a kind of philosophical kind of investigation of language or sound, or like a cerebral object relationship of sound, which I'm also really interested in, but I was always interested in like doing a turn, like a quick turn that just kind of hit you, or that made you feel like some other part of your body, but while you were still like heavily using your brain or something. So maybe the tempo creeps in as a way to kind of keep in sync with body stuff.
Another question? Yeah.
So I also do like improvised electronic performances, and one thing that like always is going on in my head is like you can't control how people perceive whatever it is that you're making. And I guess like the question that I'm asking is, do you have like a certain goal perception that you want people to experience when they listen to your stuff, or is it more just like a experience whatever it is that you feel this is what I'm going to put out there, respond accordingly?
Yeah. I'm going to loop that in with your good question that you had, which was, what are you thinking about when you're up there? I'm not trying to project my feelings.
But you don't have any sort of like predisposed like idea of an emotion that you want to convey, or is it
no. I mean, okay, so here's this. It's an interesting, like, it's a thin line between like being a performer who wants to have a lot of feelings when they're performing, but not necessarily feeling as if that is what needs to be projected or received by the audience. Like, I got a lot of feelings when I'm performing. I think that's good. Like, I layer it in there just to make sure I have a lot of feelings. I use samples from like a decade ago that make me think about, drinking tequila on the roof of Mexico just so that I can have feelings. But as far as like what goes into the audience, like, I would hate to think that you have to deal with my feelings. That's not your job. There's some licensed people that are paid very well to do that. But I do think to what you said earlier, which is like, when I put a sound out there, I want us to hold it together. Like, that's the intention. Like, I'm going to put a sound out there, and you're going to see in me as a performer that I'm holding that sound with you. Like, I'm not going to throw it out there. It's not an assault. I'm just not dumping it on you. Like, I'm going to be up there working to hold that sound, so that whether it's a sound that is kind of sweet and easy and makes us think of nice things, like that Ken Parker by way of Otis Redding track that I played for a brief moment, that, like, I'll hold that with you too, so that we can feel easy. And then if I'm going to play something very demanding and kind of ear fatiguing, then I want to hold that with you too. So I'm not going to slack. I'm not just hitting a button and saying like, oh, well, now I can relax. I've pressed play, and you guys have to deal with the assault of this intense, high-pitched cricket from Ojai. Because the crickets in Ojai are serious. I don't know if you've been there. I mean, they're serious. No joke. That's like I've never heard crickets at that high frequency, and there's a lot of them up there. There's a lot. You gotta watch it. Be warned if you go to Ojai, California. There's a lot of crickets. But I think that's what it is. It's like, it's not about like transferring. It's not like, here I am, I give you this, and then you receive it. Yes, I'm touching you with my sonic vibrations, but I'm gonna like be there with you. Like, that's the intention.
But you do have like an idea of like what might be like audibly demanding for what the listener is. That's based on people telling me or feeling what I don't think they're demanding. That's the thing is, like, I could listen to high pitched frequencies for like hours on end and be really happy about that. But I have a sense that when I've seen people respond to certain frequencies and certain things, that I know that it's demanding for some ears. No, absolutely.
And I don't think I don't necessarily feel the need to not make it demanding. I mean, this is called the experimental sound studio, so then by necessity, we experiment with the demand and the sort of push-pull of like what sounds do to our bodies. But I make the commitment to be there with you.
Yes,
like, I'm going to be present, and I'm going to go in and be really deep with the sound that I expect the audience to listen to.
Yeah, I have to be honest, that sometimes when I see music with electronics and I'm in the audience and I see the performer put in earplugs and then push the sound, because I don't want to be wearing earplugs at a concert because I want to hear what I'm presented with. That's not holding the sound with the audience in the way I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if you're gonna put someone there, you're gonna be there too, and that is a very vivid way to describe it. It's a kind of almost a responsibility to the performance and what you're working with, right?
Yeah, and it's so much more interesting to feel like, really, like, there's this new buzzword, site-specific, that is very people like. But you know, really, like our whole lives are site-specific. We're always in a site. It's very specific to that site. So here I am. I'm being site-specific. But with ears, like it's fun to like listen to the room, like, and then sometimes maybe if I do have an intention, it's like, let's listen, because we're all here and we're listening, and you're a captive audience and you've come here to listen. You've even paid to listen, so let's listen together. So like in the beginning, I listened to the air conditioner, and then I brought my tone in, and then we listened to that, and then, I don't know if you noticed, but when I stopped, actually, at the very end, the air conditioner went off exactly the same moment. There was like another HVAC, and it just clicked off, and I was like, look at that, perfect. But yeah, there's something about like, that's a part of this holding the space, is like, okay, well, we're in the site, and we're all gathered to listen. I know that you're listening intently, so I'm going to listen intently with you. I'm not just pushing, I'm also like embracing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm going to let you cool out.
Oh yeah, sorry. Now I'm
all.
We're not all worked up.
Yeah.
I don't have any more questions.
Just a real quick announcement. Next week, the series is going to continue with Wayne Horowitz on keyboards and Sarah Schoenbeck on bassoon, playing solos and duos. Please come out for that. Thanks to all of you, and thanks again, Bonnie. Really
Thanks,
amazing.
Ken.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
That's so great.